All right, hello everybody. Today we have a TI-84 plus CE calculator, and the problem with this calculator is that it has a broken charge port. I'm not sure if you can see that, but the pins are all still there, right? They're still solid, but they're exposed. They're completely exposed. There's no protection. So the way this usually works is that this little piece of plastic is inside the port, and it gives the pins some stability and rigidity so that when you plug in the cable and unplug it, the pins don't just go haywire and there's a better connection to be made. So while this technically does work, it's a very loose connection and it's best to get it repaired. But however, instead of just replacing the broken port with the same mini USB port from before, we're going to be upgrading it to a USB Type-C port. And the reason for this is just because I don't have very many mini USB cables. As you can see, this one's like factory. I haven't used this one, I just got it for demonstration. But I do own a lot of USB Type-C cables for my laptop, my phone, my Nintendo Switch, for a bunch of devices that charge over USB-C. So it's going to be a nice little quality of life upgrade. Let's get right into it. Okay, so you've probably noticed there's a bunch of materials here out on my desk, and the reason for that is that this is pretty much everything I'm going to be using to complete this job. So first and foremost, you're going to need a screwdriver kit, or just two screwdrivers. You're going to need a Phillips 000 and a Torx T6, and that's to undo the screws. And you're going to need some kind of pry tool to get underneath the plastic and pry off the plastic. Once you're inside the calculator, you're going to need a soldering station. I'm going to move over there so you can see it better. You're going to need a soldering station. I recommend one with an iron and a hot air gun because removing the charging port without a hot air gun is pretty difficult. You're going to need some flux. This is paste flux. I wish I would have bought some flux in a syringe, but this stuff works okay too. You'll notice I have this giant wooden stick, which is essentially what I use to apply the flux onto the motherboard. You're going to need some brass wool. This is for cleaning your soldering iron. As you can see, my iron, it's seen some stuff. It's got some damage here, but the tip, which is the most important part, it looks pretty nice. And the way I keep this tip looking good is, cleaning it in the brass wool every now and then, and that keeps it looking good. You're going to need some tweezers because, this is some precision work. You're going to need to be grabbing some tiny things, so you need the tweezers. You'll need some soldering wick just in case you apply too much solder and you got to remove it. You'll need some wires. These are 28 gauge and they're color coded, which is perfect. I'm going to be using a black wire for my ground connection and a red wire from my voltage connection, positive voltage. And that's for the charging circuitry. But you'll also need some thin wire. This wire here is 0.1 millimeters, and what this wire is for the data transfer function of USB. So that's, for example, when you plug the calculator into the computer and you can move files to and from the calculator. This is technically optional because not everyone may use that feature, but obviously everyone needs to charge their calculator. So if you only want to charge the calculator, you can just skip the parts where I go over the data pads. Anyway, you're going to need some pliers or wire strippers. I just use these to, run the wire, this wire, through and slowly trim off the edges so that I can have the bare copper to solder to. You're going to need some solder. This is 6040 tin lead solder. And that being said, since it is lead, I am doing this outside. As you can see, most people, have a fume hood or something, but I don't, so I just do it outside because you don't want to be breathing in those fumes and outputting them to the indoors. Anyway, you're going to need either helping hands or a PCB holder, and that's because you're going to need to be using both of your hands to solder, and something's got to hold the board while you're doing that. You're going to need a filing kit, and the reason for that is because the charge port is mini USB, but we're going to be upgrading it to USB-C, and I've got a USB-C cable here, and the connector is just bigger, so you're going to have to file down some of the plastic to make room for the new connector. And then I have some alcohol over here with some Q-tips, and that's just to remove the excess flux, because when you're applying flux there's going to be a lot of residue and stuff, and this alcohol and the Q-tips do wonders to remove all that excess. Oh, and of course the star of the show, you're going to need a USB-C port. There are a lot of options that you can use. I personally think this is the best one, and the reason for it is these two guys right here. These guys are magic. These are 5.1 kilo ohm resistors, and what these resistors allow you to do is they allow you to use the charge port with USB-C to USB-C cables, not just USB-C to USB-A. So you can get some custom boards where you can solder those resistors on yourself and stuff like that, but this board comes with them pre-applied. and I think it's worth it to just get that one. So that's all the materials out of the way. I'm gonna link to as much of this as I can in the description. Obviously some of this stuff I got like from local shops and stuff, but that's all the materials. Let's get into the process. Okay, so before we start working on the modification, I just want to give a brief overview of the functions that the calculator can perform over USB and which ones we're going to replicate. So the first function is obviously charging. This is a rechargeable battery calculator, and as we can see right here, we have a charging indicator. And the second function you just saw pop up on my computer is data transfer. So we can transfer files to and from this calculator using the cable. So those are functions 1 and 2. And then the third function is this calculator can also act as a host device, which basically means that you can connect it to another calculator, and then this calculator can be like the computer, and then the other calculator can just be like a regular calculator, and you can transfer files between them. And you can also like plug in keyboards and mice and all sorts of things into the port. So in this modification, we're going to be replicating functions 1 and 2, charging and data transfer. We are not going to be replicating function number 3, firstly because it's not a function I've ever used, and it wasn't even one that I was aware of until after I started doing these mods. And secondly, because I don't know how to replicate that, because on USB-C, the host mode works completely different than it does on mini USB. And while I'm sure there is a way to replicate it, I do not have the know-how, nor is it important to me. So just to get that out of the way, if that is important to you, that's not going to be something that I will be able to teach you how to replicate, unfortunately. But charging and data transfer will work, so let's get to it. Okay, so now with that out of the way, let's get our calculator taken apart. The only thing we're really going to need for this is our two tools right here, our screwdrivers and our little pry tool. I'm not sponsored by iFixit, but they just make really good tools. Okay, so first we're going to be taking our Phillips bit, and that's the cross bit. I'm not sure if it's going to show up very well, but yeah, it doesn't really show up. But it's the cross bit, you know, standard cross screwdriver. And we're going to use it to undo the screws on the battery cover. So there's 2 of these, and then there's 2 more under the battery. And these screws on the outside are captive for the battery cover, so that just means, you know, you'll undo them, but they stay in place, right? So that's so you don't lose them. So once they're undone, you can just remove the battery door. Now you got your battery. Before you remove your battery, make sure that if you have any programs in the calculator that are important, archive them, because as soon as you take out the memory, as soon as you take out the battery, all the memory on the calculator, the RAM, is going to be cleared. So if you have anything important in there, make sure to archive it first. But now with that all done, we can take our battery out, and we have 2 more screws. These are not captive, but they're also the same crosshead style. So we just remove these, 1 and 2. Oh. Alright, so now we got our battery door screws out of the way, so we can set this aside and not lose our screws. And now we need to take out our Torx screws. These are Torx T6 screws. They're like star-shaped. You can see there. They don't appear to be security screws, they appear to be standard, but that doesn't matter because this screwdriver kit here also accounts for the security screws. So we're taking a Torx T6 bit now, and we're removing the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 screws that are remaining on the back of the calculator here. So let's get to it. Okay, and we have all the screws removed. Okay, so now we have all our screws removed, but we need to pry in between the 2 plastic pieces here to get the calculator apart. So I always start at the top here on the side. Just stick the pry tool in between the 2 different colored pieces of plastic and pry up. And I move down and just keep prying. And then this section right here is a bit tough. Kind of where like this ridge starts. I think there's a clip in here, so you really got to force your way in there, and don't be afraid to pry hard at this part, because, you know, there you go, see, you heard a nice little unclip, and then just keep going on the way down, and then that's about as hard as you need to go on that side. So then we can go with the gentle prying again on the bottom, and then again, same story here on this side. We're going to need to pry pretty hard on this section, so get your pry tool in there. And there we go. And I think that's as bad as it gets. Yeah, you see we got most of it off now. Now we just need to pry a little bit on the top here. There we go, and the whole thing comes free just like that. So now we can set this aside. And now we have this like foil covering. I don't know if this is to prevent interference or keep the components protected from shock or whatever it may be, but basically you just get this out from sliding it through the little foam on the screen here, and that unlatches this little piece right here, and then just pull the rest of it off. It might be adhered or mounted to these like little plastic pegs like you see here, but you can just pull that off, and you'll see there's like a little bit of a connection left there, but that's no biggie. So we just, same deal here, you see it's connected to that plastic peg, but we can just pull that right off and then get rid of this. And then on my other one, on the top one here, it stayed connected, as you can see, so we can just cut that right off. And there we go. Okay, so now we can set this aside and make a little trash pile here, looks like. All right. And now, even though we have access to the motherboard right now, we're not going to be able to remove it from the body of the calculator, and that's because it's like plastic welded into place. I don't know why Texas Instruments chose to go this route when they could have just used screws, but the calculator is essentially welded to the frame, the plastic frame, because of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pegs. So you gotta break these pegs. There are a bunch of different ways that you can do this. I guess you could use like a tiny flathead screwdriver and pry up at it. That's what I used to do. If you're really sadistic, you could probably use the soldering iron and heat the plastic, but I'm not going to do that. The way I do this is with my pliers. It'd probably work better with a thinner needle nose style pliers, but it works the same. With my pliers, I just get into the groove right here, and I squeeze the plastic to deform it such that it's small enough to let me get the motherboard out through the hole. So that's how I do it, and you might get worried about, oh well, what if I scratch my motherboard? You have this gold circle. Let's get the focus in here. This gold circle is a safe space to scratch as much as you want because it's just a ground connection. So it doesn't matter if you mangle up anything inside of the gold circle. So that's why I usually don't care about messing up the calculator in this section. So yeah, I'm just gonna probably speed through this, but essentially I'm just crushing this plastic so that I can fit the motherboard through. Okay. Oh, and don't forget this bottom one. It's really easy to forget. So these are obvious because they got the gold circles, but this bottom one is really easy to miss, so make sure you get this one too. Okay, so I did the rest of that off camera, and that's just because it takes forever, but essentially you can see the plastic is now much more deformed. It doesn't take up the whole space. It should be able to fit the motherboard through these holes, and you can also see I caused some scratches, but again, any scratches inside of this gold circle are totally fine. I got some scratches down here too, but so it goes. Okay, so now that you've got all 5 of those either crunched down, ripped off, however it is you did it, you're going to want to undo the ribbon connector for the screen. You're going to want to latch up either with your fingernail or with a what are those things called? Totally blanking. Spudger. So latch up on that connection, and then you're going to need your pry tool again, and I always start at this gold connection here, and you're going to pry up gently because this is the motherboard, it's the whole brains of the calculator. So just gently pry up, and then you'll see it should come loose. See, that side's already up. Now let's do it on the other side. Just gently pry up, and there we go. So now we've got it loose from all the connections, and we just gonna raise it and then wiggle it out of that screen connection. Right there, if we can. That screen doesn't want to come off, does it? All right, there we go. Okay, we'll wiggle it out, and now we got the motherboard all by itself. Yay! Now we want to set this off with all our other parts, and be super careful with this because if you let this membrane go, all the buttons are going to go flying, and that's just an entire mess to clean up. Don't ask me how I know that. Great, okay, so now we can get to the electronics of the modification. So let's get into that. Okay, so now we're ready to get to the soldering part. As you can see, I've got my helping hands here. A PCB holder will also work just fine. But before we even attach the motherboard to these clips or anything, we're gonna deal with the underside of the USB controller. So what we're about to do is we're gonna apply heat to melt the solder that holds this connector in place, and then we're gonna use our tweezers to hold the connector as it's heated up, and it just comes right off. But there's a little catch, and the catch is that, as I mentioned earlier, the solder I will be using has lead in it, but most factory solders that are, applied by robots to modern electronics do not contain lead anymore. And while from a health standpoint, that's a good thing, from a workability standpoint, it's not so good, and the reason for that is that the leaded solder melts at a much lower temperature. So I could be blasting this with 500 degrees Celsius all day and it's not going to budge. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix some of the leaded solder in with the factory solder. That's going to lower the melting point. We're going to be able to take this off much more easily. So the places that we're going to be applying solder are the 4 mounting pads. I'm going to show them on the back because it's easier to see them. See, 1, 2, 3, 4. They're also on the front too, and we're going to apply it there, but it's harder to see. And then the 5 USB pins right here. These 5 pins and 4 pads are what are holding the connector to the board. So we're going to apply the leaded solder to all these points, and then we're going to be heating up the connector and removing it. So let's get started with the back of the motherboard, and let's see if I can zoom in here. Oh, yeah, look at that. That's not very good, is it? Okay. Okay, so, not the best resolution, but I am filming from my phone, so I'm expecting limitations. So, let's get our soldering iron turned on here. So as you can see, it's off right now, but let's get it turned on. And I only want the iron right now, so I'm going to push the 2 buttons on hot air just to turn it off. It's going to be off by default, but just to be safe. So I'm going to let my iron heat up. And then I'm going to take my iron. As you can see here, it's nice and clean. Actually, no, before I take my iron, I'm going to take my flux, and I apply it with just this wooden stick because I don't have anything else. I'm going to take a nice, generous blob of flux. There's no such thing as too much flux. I mean, there is, but you can always clean it off. So I'm going to take my flux, and I'm going to apply it to these 4 mounting pads. So I'm just going to kind of go willy-nilly, just let it get all in there. Alright, and that should be good. So obviously there's a lot more there. And the flux just helps the solder flow. It's a lot easier to work with. So now that we got our flux on, oh sorry, excuse my hand. We're going to take our solder, and now also our soldering iron. Sorry, I got like a million cables here. I want to make sure I don't melt any of them. Whoop. Alright, there we go. We're going to take our solder and our soldering iron, and we're just going to apply this leaded solder to the 4 pads here. So let's start with this back one. Alright, good. 2, yep, 3, and 4. 4 is a little more stubborn. Okay, and we have leaded solder on all of these pads. We're just going to go over them and make sure they're good. This one's a little stubborn. Let's just get some more in there. Alright, great. Okay. And now, let me zoom out again. And now we're going to take our soldering iron, and I don't know if this step is necessary, but I just like it. I just dip it in the flux right here, and then I put it in the brass wool to clean it off. And look at that, we got a nice fresh tip, so we can put that back. We can turn it off. Actually, no, we're going to be using it pretty soon, so let's just leave it on. Okay, I'm going to get some more solder out here. As you can see, there's not much of a length left there, so I'm just going to pull more out. There we go. So we can use that later. Okay. Oh, it's a bit of a mess. Alright, there we go. So now, the way that we can tell that there is leaded solder added to these pads is that the factory solder is kind of, as you can see right here, it's, it's kind of just dull. It's kind of dull, just like metallic, whatever. It's as if, like seeing an old coin or something. But the leaded solder is a lot shinier. As you can see, it's not perfect, but, there's a bit more of a shine to it, and the flux helps with that too. So now that we've got leaded solder added to these bottom pads, we're going to add it to the top 2 and these 5 pins. So let's get to that. For that, I am going to be using the helping hands, and I'm going to clamp them to a spot that doesn't have any components on it, because obviously we don't want to be clamping like a chip or any capacitors or resistors or anything. So I'm going to clamp it here, and I'm going to clamp it here. Nope, that's not going to work. Okay. That one clamp should be enough. I mean, ideally, I'd like to have more clamps, but that should be good. Okay, so now that we've got it clamped, we're going to add flux again, this time to the entire perimeter of the USB connector. So just let's get that one side, and let's get the other side. And then what's really important is to get the back pins. This isn't really a good view of them, but you saw them earlier, and I'm just going to apply the flux back here to those pins. Okay, great. So now that we got flux on our connector, it's time to add solder just like before. So let's get our iron and our solder. And let's start with these back connectors. Let's just get that all in there. Okay, let's get a little more. Great, okay, and now let's go around the perimeter of the port to get those mounting pads that we did earlier. It's important to get them from the front here too. Okay, and let's get the other side. It's a bit of a awkward. Alright, that works. Okay, I think that's good, and once again, let's zoom out here. Let's put our iron in the flux and the brass wool, clean it off, and put that away. Okay, so now let's take a look at this board, and there should be leaded solder, shinier solder. There, you can see that, there's a huge glob there, and that's okay. Doesn't matter if there are bridges or anything like that, there's a little bit there too. Now let's check the pads. Yep, you can see the middle pads are bridged, but again, that's okay. The only thing we want to do is add leaded solder, and we've succeeded in that. So now the temperature, the melting temperature of this solder should be much lower, and we should be able to remove this connector much more easily. So let's do that. Alright, so now we've got the leaded solder added to the connector. We've got it held in place with our clips here of the helping hands. So now we're not going to be using the soldering iron anymore. We're going to be using the hot air station for this part. So we're going to add flux once more because we want the solder to flow. So once again, add flux to the perimeter. And if you really want to, you can add it to the bottom too. I don't think let's go ahead and do it. I don't really have much of a visual, but let's just scrape that all along the bottom. So now we have flux on all the same points as before. And now we're going to go to our soldering station here. We're going to turn on the hot air, so press both buttons, and turn off the iron. And now you see these dashes. That's because I haven't picked up the hot air gun. As soon as I pick it up, see, it's going to start to heat up. And if I were, really serious about this, I'd probably put a nozzle on here to make it, so there's a smaller area of coverage. But I've done this enough times to where it's not a big deal. So we're going to let that heat up. I have this at 365 Celsius, same for the iron, and about I'd say 4/10 airspeed. Again, this isn't like the best recommendations or anything. It's just what I am using. So now we're going to get our hot air station in one hand and our tweezers in the other. I would do dominant hand tweezers and hot air station non-dominant hand because it doesn't matter the precision with which you hold the hot air. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our tweezers. Actually, it'd be better if I showed this first person, so let me do that real quick. We're going to take our tweezers and put one end on the top part of the connector here. See how we're not all the way in there? And then the other end just grabbing it, and we're going to grab just like that. And you got to be careful because you're going to be hitting this metal, and the metal of the tweezers is conductive too, so you might burn yourself. But that's the sacrifice we're just going to have to be willing to make, I guess. Okay, so alright, we got our board held in place again, we got all our flux applied, and now we got our tweezers holding. Actually, I might do non-dominant just because it's closer to my one. No. Okay, we got our port held with our tweezers, and the only thing you're going to do is you're going to hold. You're not going to yank up on this port when you think it's ready to go. You're not going to, I guess you can wiggle it, but you're not going to pull, you're not going to yank, and you're not going to do any of that. And the reason you're not going to do that is because you could tear the pads underneath, and at that point you've essentially rendered the entire modification useless if that happens. So don't yank, don't pull, just hold it and it should come off literally just with the strength of the heat. So we got our connector firmly held, and now we got our hot air. Actually, let me move my hand further back. It's not a good look. There we go. Okay, now my hand's a little further back, and we got our hot air. So just blow the hot air on the connector, and you know, circle around because you want to get the border as well as the pins behind. And how long we have to do this for varies. It should be no more than a few seconds, maybe like 40. But the way that you know you're almost done is the flux is going to smoke. So once you start seeing smoke, I don't know if it shows up on the camera, but I can see a little bit of smoke. But once you start seeing like a lot of smoke and dripping flux, you're going to feel the connector get looser and looser. And look at this, I'm not applying any force, I'm just heating it and holding it with my tweezers. And the connector should come loose. And be careful with this screen connector here. It's plastic, so I'm, you know, pointing the air away from that. Should have said that earlier, sorry. So yeah, just applying a lot of heat to this connector here. Holding onto it with the tweezers. And yep, it's lifting up, it's lifting up, it's lifting up. And no force, no force. Okay, needs a little more. There we go. Okay, great. And we got the connector off. You see? I needed to give it a little oomph there at the end, but I never, you know, yanked or anything like that. Okay, so at this point we're done with the hot air. We've removed our broken charging port, so we can put our hot air gun back, turn it off, and turn our soldering iron on. And now we got the old connector removed, and the only thing we have left here is the pads. I'm really sorry for the low resolution, it's just the zoom on my phone. And there we can see those same bridge pads we saw earlier, but the important thing is we don't see any torn or ripped pads, which is a huge win. So now we just want to get some flux on this giant glob here. And that's going to help, you know, get the solder out of the way and connect to where it needs to. So we're going to get some flux, and then we're just going to apply our iron and see if we can, you know, straighten those pads out. There, you see, look at that. Flux is magic. Okay, but even though it's starting to get a little better, there's still way too much solder on there. So this is where our wick from earlier comes into play. So you just take your wick, and just like a candle, you know, you want a lot of wick there so that you can work with it. Put it on top of the solder area that you want to remove, and then put your iron over it, and the wick should just absorb all that solder. You see how it's changing color there? See, look at that, it's absorbing all the solder. We can do this on the ground pads too, especially the back ones, because we're not going to be using the back ones anymore. And I guess the front ones while we're at it too. Great, okay. So we've removed all the excess solder, but you can probably, you can probably tell there's a bit of a yellowish hue there, and that's the flux residue, but that's okay. I mentioned this earlier, and we're going to be cleaning that with our Q-tips and our alcohol. It's way too zoomed in for you guys to see that, but that's okay. Just get your alcohol open, grab a Q-tip. If you were really serious about this, there's also these like swabs that don't leave behind strands like Q-tips do, but I don't think it's that huge a deal. So you take your alcohol, apply it to the Q-tip, and I like using one side of the Q-tip for the alcohol and then the other side for drying. So we're gonna take our Q-tip and just clean up all this flux residue. And I'm using 91% isopropyl. Higher percentage the better. There's 99%, there's also 70. Anything should be good. Look at that. You see how the Q-tip's all yellow and now it's nice and clean on the board. And then we're gonna dry off. And now, of course, we're gonna do the back. So let's get another Q-tip. And let's flip this over. So unclip it. Oh, sorry about that view. There, look at all that flux. So we're just going to take our alcohol Q-tip and wipe it clean. Look at that, like magic. And like nothing ever happened here. Great, okay. So now we got a clean back. We got, oh, look at that. Got a bit of solder on this button here. So again, that's something I'll just use the wick for and remove. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to film that because it's not in our position, but I'll show you the after results. So I applied my wick over the button contact. It didn't get rid of the solder, it just kind of, made it less apparent. Hopefully this shouldn't affect the function of that arrow button, but we'll see later. That's okay, these kinds of things happen. We make precision mistakes and such, but the important thing is we got our connector off and all our pads are still intact. So now would be a good time for me to tell you what all these pads mean. So here closest to the screen connector is pad number 1. It's actually labeled with a number 1 right there, you can see. This pad number 1 is for voltage, positive power. We're going to be soldering a red wire to it. And I'm going to skip over all the way to pad number 5 here, which is ground, and we're going to be using a black wire. And that's for those of you that only want charging capabilities. These are the two you want. You want voltage here, and you want ground here at number 5. So 1 voltage, 5 ground. If you care about data transfer, these two pins are important. This is data minus, the one closer to the voltage, and then this is data positive, the one that's pin number 3 when looking at it from top to bottom. Pin number 4, we're not going to use. That's the pin that takes care of all that host device mode that I talked about earlier that I don't know how to replicate. So let's just recap. We've got 5 pins here, and we're only going to be using 4 of them, 2 for power and 2 for data. If you don't care about data, then I guess you only use the power ones here. And, whoop, sorry about that. Once we have our USB-C connector in place, and a little spoiler, look, this one also has pads for voltage and ground, like I mentioned earlier, and we're just going to be soldering a black wire from ground to there and a red wire from voltage to there. But once we have our USB-C connector in place, we're going to be using the front 2 anchorage pads here to solder to the metal casing of the port, and that's going to hold it. Oh, let's get some focus in here. That's going to hold it nice and sturdy. Alright, so let's get to that. Alright, so at this point in the modification you have a choice to make. You get to choose whether or not you're only going to solder the power connections, so you're only going to support charging, or if you're also going to solder the data connections. Obviously only soldering the power connections is much easier, it's less work that you have to do, and this connector, it already has the, let me get that focused, already has the connections necessary for power exposed. If you want the data ones, you're going to have to break off this rubber piece, and while it's not the hardest thing in the world, it is an extra step, along with the extra soldering that you're going to have to do. So choose whether or not you want power and data, or if you only want power, and we'll move on from there. Okay, so for those of you that want power and data, you have to break off this rubber piece. Now, I'm going to show you how I do it. That's not necessarily to say that this is the best way to do it, or the only way, but the way I do it is I take my the sharp part of my pliers here, and I snip the sides. You see that? I snip the sides off, I snip this side, and I snip this side. And then once those sides are off, I use the same pry tool from earlier, and I pry off the remaining like rubber, like that on the top, and like that on the bottom. So let's do that right now. Okay, so I'm probably going to speed through that part of the video, but hopefully you were able to see that I removed this side part with the pliers, I removed the other side part with the pliers, and then I just pried up on the remaining part, and now we have all the pads necessary exposed. So again, we're only going to be using these voltage and ground pads that are already exposed. If we really wanted to, we could like solder tiny wires to the voltage and ground pins, but that's just counterintuitive, it doesn't make sense. But what we are going to need to do is solder to the data pins on this, and I'll show you exactly which ones they are. Hopefully this wick will let me. So you'll see, starting from the leftmost side, we have a pin number 1 here, and then a pin number 2, and pin number 3. It's not really working, but just count from the leftmost side, in this case the top. Pin number 1 is a ground, pin number 2 is a voltage, which we're not going to be using since we already have the pads, and then pin number 3 is a data negative, and pin number 4 is a data positive. And if we flip it over, it's the same story on this side, starting from the top in this view, but the left from the other view, like that. Pin number 1 is a ground, pin number 2 is a voltage, and pin number 3 is data minus, and pin 4 is data plus. So now we're going to be soldering to pins 3 and 4 with our super tiny thin wire that we mentioned at the start of the video here. This is 0.1 millimeters, okay? So let's get to it. Okay, so for this part, we're going to need our thin wire, our scissors to cut the wire, and our flux, solder, and soldering iron to solder to the wires. So there's no really clear-cut way to know what length is best. I do a length of about, I don't know, I'd say, what is that? Maybe two, oh, you can't even see that. There we go, you can see it against that backdrop. Probably like 2 inches of wire, and you're gonna need 4 of these. Why? Because you need data minus and data plus, but you need one on each side. The reason you need one on each side is because USB-C, of course, is reversible. You can plug it in one way and then you can flip it and plug it the other way. And for that, you need to solder to all of the symmetric connections. So let's cut off about 2 inches of wire here. There we go. And then we're going to cut off 3 more just like that. Okay, so now I have my 4 strands of wires cut, and you may be thinking, oh, it's just bare copper wire, so we can solder to it super easily, but that's not the case. This is actually enameled wire, so we're going to need to solder to the ends of the wire. And the way that I do this, I'm not sure if this is going to look good on camera, but I take the wire, I'm holding it, I know you, there you go, you can see it against the backdrop. I take the wire and then I clip it here on these alligator clips, right through the middle. Let's see if I can zoom in to get a better view of what's going on. Oh yeah, so there you can see the wire is clipped and it's super, super thin. And what I do is let's look up a little. There we go. There you can see the end of the wire. Let's move forward a little. Yep, you can see that. Okay. So right here is the end of the wire. I'm going to do this to both ends, but it looks like I'm only going to be able to show one on camera. I take my flux with my super janky way of, with the stick here, and I just coat both ends of the wire in flux. And, you can hold the wire to make it more steady as you're doing this step. Yeah, there we go, and we got a nice coat of flux there. I'm not sure if that shows up well. So do this to both sides. And this will make it easier to melt through the enamel with the solder and apply the solder to both ends that we will need. Okay, great, and that's a good amount of flux. And now, once again, we take our soldering iron and we take our solder. So let's get both. Take our soldering iron and make sure you've been taking care to, I'm not sure if it's going to show up on camera, clean the iron with the brass spool in between each session. So then we just kind of hold the solder over the end of the wire, take the iron here, and okay, sorry about that abrupt cut. My phone had run out of storage to keep filming, and I hadn't realized, but that's okay. Basically, I just tinned all of these wires here, these like thin wires, and you can see like these two are really good. You can see the solder on them. The rest of them aren't that good, but that's okay. Just do it as best you can. It is a little bit challenging, especially with wires so thin, but now that we've got our wires tinned, at least for me, to my satisfaction, what we're going to do is we are going to solder the wires to the actual USB-C port, and it's those same number 3 and number 4 pins that I mentioned earlier, but we're going to do them one at a time. First, we're going to do both number 3 pins, and then we're going to do both number 4 pins. So let's get our USB-C port attached to this clip here. Okay, great. Yep, that's pretty solid. And let's zoom in. Alright, that's as far as it zooms in, and the image isn't very clear, but hopefully you can see exactly what I'm doing. Okay, so like always, before we solder, we're going to add flux to the place we're soldering to. It makes it a lot easier and a lot more manageable. So let's get our flux, and we want around this area. You see this like area I'm highlighting here, pin 3, but pin 4 is okay too. So let's get our flux in there, and there we go. That's good. Great, okay. Oh, and yeah, we should also probably add flux to our ground and voltage pads. Those are going to be a lot easier to solder to. They're nice and big. I wish this port had data pads. Maybe they'll make a version with it in the future, but for now, this is how we have to do it. That's okay. Okay. So now, let's take our wire. Let's take one of our wires here. Grab it with our tweezers. Alright, there we go. I'm grabbing the wire with tweezers, and we're going to hold it up to pin number 3. Actually, my helping hands have the option for a light, so let me get that turned on. There we go, it's a lot better. Got more light so we can see what's going on. And again, we're going to attempt to solder pin number 3. Alright, and I think we got it. Yeah, we can see very clearly there. Pins 1 and 2 on the left. I'm going to get my tweezers in view. Pins 1 and 2 on the left, and then pin 3. And we know it's solid because we can move back. We can, tug on it, everything, and it is connected there. Great. Okay, so we got pin number 3 on this side. Now let's get pin number 3 on the other side. So let's flip the connector. And same deal, we're going to apply flux and get our wire attached. Alright, and that is solidly attached to pin number 3. Great, perfect. So now I'm just going to double check to make sure there aren't any bridges in between the pins, and I'll be back. Okay, so I checked, all the connections are good, and right now we only want to worry about pins number 3 that we have soldered to. We don't want to get 4 on there quite yet, and the reason for that is that we want to connect these 2 wires. Let me see if I can pull it to show the end. We're going to take these 2 ends of the wires and we're going to solder them together. So as best we can right now, let's just kind of join the wires together. There, and let's get some flux on there and solder, and you know the drill. And that way we can just solder a single connection instead of having to finagle with the 2 loose wires. I mean, it's possible they could come loose later, but this way at least we try. Some flux on there. Alright, it's a little more difficult with such a small area to work with, but now we got our flux. So let's get our solder and join these 2 wires. Okay, and I think that's okay. I think that works. Again, it's really hard to see anything, but you should be able to see that the end is like a little more silver and a little more joined together, okay? So now we're going to do that same thing, except with pins number 4. And I don't think I'm going to show it, it's the same thing, just solder to that end, flip it over, solder to the other end, and then join the 2 wires. So I'll be back once I'm done doing that. Okay, so on camera, I did the connection to pin number 3, which again is data negative, and it's connected to the one in the back here. So you can see they're soldered together. And then off camera, I did pin number 4 here, also on the back. And again, they are soldered together. So let's take a look at the back. See again, pins 3 and 4 are the ones that are connected. Super tiny, but it's been done. It is a little difficult, but that's the hardest part. Everything else from here is pretty smooth. Okay, so now we're going to solder to our voltage and ground pads. They are much bigger and they're bidirectional already, so we only need to solder 1 time. Excuse me as I mess with the lighting balance here. Okay, so these ones are super easy, but let's get our wire ready. Let me zoom out for this. So we're going to be using red and black wire. For length, I'd say I guess about the same as the length of the copper, like 2 inches here should be good for both red and black. So I cut this wire with my with the sharp end of my pliers, and I also use this to strip the wire, so let's do that. Alright, so we have our two pieces of wire here cut, red for voltage and black for ground. And as I mentioned earlier, this is 28 gauge wire. They are wrapped in silicone, but the thing is we want to solder to each end of the wire, and they're covered in the silicone. So what we're going to do is we're going to strip the wire, and you can buy wire strippers for this. They make it really easy, but it's not all too hard to do it with the pliers either. What I do is I just take it so that I run the wire through like the hollow end of the plier cutters here, and then I just kind of slowly, I guess the red wasn't the best one to demonstrate this with. I'll demonstrate it with sorry, I thought the black one wasn't the best. I'll demonstrate it with red here. So I take the red wire, and there we go. You can see that a lot more clearly. Let me focus. And it's, hard to see, but essentially I'm just like slowly chipping away at the silicone. Slowly, I'm not actually cutting, I'm just like letting the blade sort of pierce into the silicone. And once it gets loose enough, I should just be able to, it's like happen soon here. Oh. Just keep sort of biting away, and then boom, just comes right off, and you have an exposed piece of wire. So now I'm going to do that to the other end, and I'm going to do it to both ends of the black wire. Alright, so now as you can see, I have stripped both ends of my wires here, and I'm sure as you can guess by now, you're going to add flux and solder to these exposed ends. So I'll just clip it in here as usual, grab my flux, apply flux to each end, and it's much easier to work with this thicker wire. And the reason we're using thicker wire is because for the thinner wire, the only thing we're doing is jumping the data pads. That's no big deal. But for the thicker wire, we're passing 5 volts through this wire. So while we could do it through the thin wire, obviously we want something that's a little more robust to handle voltage and current. Okay, so now let's get our soldering iron and our solder. And this will be like 2 seconds, whereas the thin wires, it was like 20 minutes. Yeah, alright, now that it's heated up. And boom, that's tinned like it was no big deal. And same over here. Okay, so now the red wire's been tinned, and it's the exact same process for the black one, so I'll do that off camera. Okay, so I have tinned both the red wire and the black wire. Now what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the USB-C port again. And let's get the lighting right, and we're going to add flux to the voltage and ground pads and solder. So let's do that. So here first we're going to do ground and then voltage, and be super careful not to short these with the data wires you have earlier. You can kind of, move them out of the way. Oh, looks like I got it backwards. Sorry, it's really hard to see the letters, but no matter. We're just adding solder right now, so let's get our iron and our solder. And boom, that pad has solder. Let's get this pad over here. And I can't tell. Hold on. No, it needs a little more. Alright, that should be good once we get this on here. There we go. Okay, great. So now we have our wires tinned, we have our pads tinned. Now it is time to solder the wires, the voltage and ground wires, to the port. Okay, so in this view we have ground on the left and voltage on the right, so let's solder accordingly. Let's take our voltage wire first, since it is looser. We're going to place it on this pad and just apply our soldering iron heat. It should connect fairly quickly. Yep, there we go. We got a solid connection. Now let's add a little more solder just to not have such an exposed wire. There we go, that's more like it. Okay, and that is not bridging with anything else. Perfect. Okay, so now let's take our black wire, which again has been pre-tinned and has flux on it. We're going to take it here on the ground connection and being super careful not to intertwine it with any of the other wires that we've already soldered. And that is a solid connection. So now we're just going to do one quick look over. So we have our two data pairs and they are soldered on solidly. This is the 3 and this is the 4, and they correspond to 2 and 3 on the actual calculator. And then our voltage and our ground are soldered beautifully. Alright, so now it's time to add this to the calculator. So I'm going to get the calculator in these clips and I'll be back. Alright, so it's been a while since we've seen the calculator motherboard, but now we are back. And now let's focus our attention once again to the USB port area of the motherboard. Perfect, okay. So that's as far, I'm so sorry for the instability. It's about as far as we can zoom in. And I'm just going to highlight it with my stick here. This area is the one we're interested in. Again, as I said before, the pin closest to the screen connector is pin 1 for voltage, for red, and then the next two pins are data minus, data plus, and ground is the very last one. Now, voltage and ground are no big deal because those are color-coded. So let's take care of the data connections, which are not color-coded. Let's take care of getting those in order first so that we don't mess them up. But before we connect those wires, that sounded like a sponsor segue, but it's not, we're going to add a lot of solder to these front two pads, and the reason for that is, again, when we have our connector soldered in, you know, we don't want it to just be like willy-nilly, just loose. We're going to use those front two as like anchor points and, you know, solder it. And another important note is we want our port to stick out a little bit. We don't want it to be flush with the motherboard because, you know, then it's not going to plug as easily when we put a cable in there. We want it to stick out a little, okay? So let's add solder to these front two pads. Okay, and that looks like it's about as good as it's going to get for now. So let's move our attention to the USB-C port. We can pre-solder the metal on that to make our life a little bit easier. So this side with the voltage and ground pads is going to be the upper side, so we want to solder to the metal of the underside because that's what's going to be making contact with the pads that we just tinned. So let's add some flux to the metal. Oh, and this flux is really sticking on there. Okay, no matter. Okay. So we added our flux. And that's a lot of flux, but that's okay. And now let's add our solder. So let's get my solder out here. Oh. Now it's going to be much easier to make a connection because we have our solder. And that way we don't have to rely on adhesives or clips or anything. I mean, obviously the screwing mounts of the calculator are going to help keep the port secure, but this is just one step further to secure it. Okay, great. So now let's do our data connections. So let's just pick one to do first. I'm going to say sorry, let me go back to the calculator view. I guess it would make the most sense to do pin number 2, which is data negative, and it corresponds to pin number 3 on this port. So let us find pin 3 on the port. Let me get it in the light there. Okay. And it looks like this is pin 3. Yep, okay. And then we can double check that. So the one that is going outwards from the red cable, let's flip it over, and outwards from the red cable, and sure enough, that is connected to the leftmost pin 3. Okay. So pin 3 on this USB-C port corresponds to pin 2 on this USB pads. But if you remember earlier, we removed all the solder earlier, so let's just get our iron on there real quick and get a little teeny tiny bit of solder and flux on there just to make the surface more workable. So a teeny bit, and because these pads are super small, we don't want to bridge them. Alright, and that should be good, but again we have that residue, so I'm going to clean up and I'll be back after I finish applying the alcohol. Okay, so I've cleaned up the flux with alcohol. I've got the pads tinned a little bit. Now it is time for the moment of truth. We're going to take our USB-C port, and remember I mentioned earlier that the wire coming off here from the red is our pin 3, which goes to pin 2. I know it's a bit confusing, but you know that will vary for you. Just make sure that you are absolutely certain of which one you are connecting. For data, it's not that important. If you mix them up and then you plug it in and it doesn't work, it's not going to kill the calculator or anything. But for power, if you put these backwards, that will absolutely fry your charging circuit if you plug it in, so do not do that. But again, you know, better to be cautious and pay attention to which data pin you are soldering, but it won't, you know, kill the calculator if you get it wrong. So let me just really grab this wire solidly. I don't want it flailing or anything. I want to get it soldered onto that pin nice and neat. So pin number 2, and let's apply some heat to get this soldered on. Okay, there we go. I think we got it. You can see there our wire is connected to pin 2. It doesn't look like it's bridging with anything else. So now let's get our pin 3 wires, our data positive, and do the same thing. So let's grab this pair here and fold it over. This is going to be a lot harder because now you've already got that other connection, but again, just put it on that sort of general area of pin 3 and get your iron and, you know, solder it on down. I apologize if it's going to be difficult to see on video. I'm just, you know, trying to do the best technique with my hands. Okay, actually that was really, really fast and really, really easy, and I think I got it. You can see that nice glob of solder on pin 3 right there, and it looks like it's making a good connection. I'll double check later. But now it's time to connect our voltage and ground, now that our data connections are good. Or, you know, they appear to be good anyway. We will double check, of course. So now let's take, I guess first our red wire and solder to pin number 1. So, I'm sorry for all the wobbliness. It's just that the port isn't really secured down yet, so it's a little difficult. So now let's solder this to pin number 1, and we're going to be super precise. Okay, there we go, and I think that's done. Yeah. Okay, and now let's solder. The nice thing about this is we can solder it either to pin 5 or any of these back 2 pins, because it's, all of them are ground connections, but let's try to solder it to pin 5, and if we can't, we can just solder it to one of the ground pads. So let's take the black wire and pin 5, and there we go. Okay, so now at this point all our connections should be good. They're not the neatest in the world, but I think it's pretty solid. Considering, you know, I got the tripod in front of me and I've never filmed and all that stuff, but you know, it doesn't have to look pretty, it just has to work. So at this point we can test it. Obviously it'd be better to, you know, secure the port down, solder it down, but I don't really want to solder the port in place without knowing if this works. So let me just grab my USB-C charger right here, and if all went well, this LED should turn on green when I plug it in. So let's see if we have a good connection or not. Ready? All right. Sorry, it's takes a lot to. Okay, and do we have a green LED? We do not. Okay. So let's try it flipped around, maybe. And no LED either. Okay, so I'm gonna give this a closer look and see what went wrong, and I'll be back. Alright, so good news. I've got it working now, just for demonstration purposes. Let me plug in the cable here, and you should see this light turn green. There we go, we got a green light, and just to make sure, let's unplug the cable. And then flip the cable and plug it in again. And look at that, we got reversibility. Let me bring it closer now. So as you can see, every order of the connection is still the same. It's still red, the two data, and then the black ground. But the problem, why it wasn't working earlier, is because there was solder in between these pins. They were bridged together. And obviously it won't work if the pins are bridged together, but it's more difficult for me to see that, sorry, when I'm working with the tripod in front of me and the camera blocking my view and stuff. I don't really have it set up so I can see the camera feed as I'm working. But that's okay. Once I was able to troubleshoot off camera, I was able to really get my face up in this area of the board, and now everything should be working in terms of power. At least that's only going to tell us if power works. We're not sure if our data connections are good yet, but I mean, at least the pin number 3 one looks really solid. Pin number 2, it looks like it'll do. But anyway, let's get our connector soldered onto these front ports, and again, we want to make sure that the connector does stick out a little bit. We don't want it flush, we want it to stick out a little. So let's get that done, and let's solder it in place and get it back together, and hopefully we have a working USB-C TI-84. It's really exciting. Okay. And I probably shouldn't be using my bare hands for this because the metal's going to get super hot, but I don't really have another method of doing it. I'm not sure of how else I could, so I'm just going to place that port with my hands where I think it's best. See, it sticks out a little bit, and then I'm just going to bring the iron to the side here and hopefully melt some of that solder and join it together. Okay, we have a connection, but it's only on one side. We gotta get the other side now. Okay, and now we got both sides. So now it's, I push on that. That's not, oh well, looks like it's a little loose. So let's just tidy it up a little bit here. Alright, sorry about that. I just wanted to make sure that we have solid connections on either side, and we got a solid connection there, and we have a solid connection there. It is on a bit of an incline. I'm going to see if I can bring that down a little bit to flatten it, but as far as it stands right now, the port is sticking out, and that is not going anywhere. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can just lower it a little bit, and then we should be good to go. Alright, I'm gonna go and get a brush that I have to clean off the flux that I got on the inside of the port, and I'll be back. Alright, so I went and picked up what is essentially the head of like an old toothbrush here, and that's used exclusively to clean electronics. And I'm just gonna brush the inside of the USB-C port here just to clean out any flux that might have gotten inside of it. And that should be good, that looks clean on the inside. Okay, and now we're gonna continue where we left off with the flux on the bottom and trying to bring this port down. And again, probably shouldn't be using my bare hands on like this scalding hot metal, but I'm not sure how else to do it. And we see the green light. How great is that? Okay, now all that's left to do is for us to get this back together and test the data pads. But remember from earlier that the hole for the connector is going to need to be enlarged to fit this new connector, so that's what we're going to do next. Okay, so as I said before, you're going to need a filing set, and the two kinds of files we're going to need are a rounded file, so I'm going to grab that one. It's like rounded, and this is just to get the edges of the port, and then we're going to need a flat one as well. And the flat one is just to get the top and bottom of the port, and as you can see I've used these before. Okay, so we're going to get our files, and we're also going to want to have a USB-C cable handy, and that way we can test fit to see if the port is large enough. And before we start filing, we're going to need to do two things. So the first thing is we're going to take our tweezers and grab this indicator light guide and remove it, because, you know, it's very likely we can damage it as we're filing. So just get that out of there. There we go. And we're going to set that aside. And then the next thing is we're going to take our pliers and we're going to essentially remove, this is the charging port area. Let me get that in focus. We're going to remove, you know, this like surrounding plastic of the charging port, because now we have a larger port occupying that space and this plastic is just going to get in the way. So let's remove all that plastic with our pliers. Okay, and while that's not perfect, that is considerably less space and it's going to fit a lot nicer. Okay, so now at this point we can take our motherboard and kind of do a test fit to see where it is that we need to file the most off. So try to align the hole here at the top, and we can see that we got to file more so on this right side more than anything. So let's get to it, this side closer to the indicator light hole. Okay, so let's get our file, start with the rounded one, and, you know, just kind of get in there and go. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. I'm just gonna do this for a bit and I'll be back when I think the hole should be big enough. And of course it's not just this side, we have to get a little bit on the other side too, but you know, you got to put emphasis on the side. And again, that's just for my situation. You do your own test fit and see how it looks. Alright, so I think I've widened it pretty well, but I should get some of this bottom piece a little more, and for that I'm going to use the flat file. Alright, that's pretty sizable. Let me test fit the cable and see if it fits. So I got my cable here. Let me see if it can go through the... Oh yeah, comfortably. Okay, so now let me test fit my motherboard. And it looks like yes. Looks like I might have overdone it even, but that's okay. As long as I can plug in the cables. So let me, now with my motherboard in place, let me get my cable and see if I can plug it in. And yep, sure enough, you can't really see the light, but there it is. And you know, even though we know it's gonna work, let's flip the cable. And sure enough, there is the light. Okay, great. So now all that's left to do is reassemble the calculator as before. So to do that, let's take our part right here, and making sure that the flap for the ribbon cable of the screen is lifted up. We're going to plug in the screen ribbon. Okay, and now with that plugged in, we should just be able to put the motherboard back in to the housing. There we go. All right, and now before we get the back on, let's get this aluminum kind of shielding thing back on. So with this flap going under the foam, oh, almost dropped it there, that would have been bad. Okay, so with that flap there, and line it up. Okay, great. And now before we get the back on, let's make sure we get the indicator light installed back in its position. So let's put this down for a second. And take your plastic for the indicator light that you set aside earlier and put it back in its location. Oh. There we go. There we go, that's solid. Okay. Now we should just be able to clip the back on. Okay, and the way I like to do it is I start with the charging port hole, so I Make sure that fits first. And once I have that in, I sort of clip the rest of the plastic into place. And you know, you can see here, it's not the neatest thing in the world, but hopefully it should work. Okay, so before we screw everything down, let's just make sure this works. I'm gonna get my laptop ready to test the data connection, and I'll be right back. Okay, so now it's time to test if the data connections are good. So at this point we've got the back snapped on, but we don't have the screws in. And that's because, you know, if it doesn't work, we're gonna have to take it apart and, you know, look around, see what's going on. But we can put the battery in. So put the battery in. And good, the calculator still works. Let's just, you know, type some random stuff. Yep, okay. And now we're going to take our USB-C cable here that's plugged into the computer. And this is a USB-C to USB-C cable. So we take this cable and plug it into the calculator, and if all goes well, we should see an orange light, and we should see it pop up on the computer. Yes, and yes. Okay. And let's go here. And yep, all the files are there, but now, since this is USB-C, and we soldered 2 connections, we should be able to unplug, flip, plug back in, and look at that, we have reversibility for both charging and data transfer. That is not a feature we had before with the mini USB connector. This is awesome. It's going to be able to charge with the same cable as my laptop and phone and so many other electronics now. You know, just for the heck of it, let's try a USB-C to USB-A cable here. I mean, like, obviously it's going to work, but... So there we go, we plugged in our USB-C to USB-A cable. Now we're going to plug it into the calculator. And yep, charging and data. And now we flip it. Charging and data. Okay, so our port is all good to go. I mean, the cut isn't necessarily the cleanest. Let's see if I can get a better shot of that. Yeah, there we go. The cut isn't the cleanest, but you know, it functions, and that's all we need it to do. And I personally think this is going to be a lot more convenient. There's no excessive bowing or anything. You can't really tell that much work has been done on this calculator. It still looks really good. So all that's left to do is screw it back together, and it should be good to go. Thank you for watching. I hope you have luck either converting your calculators or following this mod for anything else. Please let me know if this was helpful. I haven't really done this style of video before, and it really is a lot of information to condense into one kind of thing, but I do hope that it was insightful and enjoyable for those of you that like this kind of stuff, and I thank you for watching. Goodbye.